What's up, guys? Gabriel Ellis from TNG Fitness here again. Today I wanted to talk about how are you going to develop your plan. A plan is not as simple as some people might think that it is. You have to figure out how it is going to help you reach your goal. So it needs to be broken down into three different categories. These are typically referred to as your mesocycle, your macrocycle, and your microcycle. So, although the terms aren't really what are important, the thought process behind them is. So, a macro cycle is typically thought of as being a 1 year time period. So, even if your goal is longer than a year long, or is going to take longer than a year for you to achieve, you need to figure out what is achievable by the end of the year. 1 year from today, what do you think you can achieve? You need to be realistic with yourself. What is obtainable and achievable and realistic, but still challenging for you? So, with that being said, going back to the macro cycle. Macro cycle, a year. What can you do in a year? All right, so then to break that year down a little bit more, so now that you've defined your end goal for the year, you need to figure out what that year is going to consist of in order to get you to that point. That is going to prevent you from wandering, kind of getting lost in your training, just kind of showing up to the gym and doing whatever you feel like that day. Because at the end of the day, if that's what you do, if you just do what you feel like you want to do, that's not going to get you to where you want to be. I promise you. You have to come up with a game plan so that you can execute it each and every day. Even if you have some days that you're kind of faltering, you don't really feel like going, it is still beneficial for you to go. And we can talk about overtraining and how you need to adjust accordingly and all of that later on. But today I want to talk about your plan. So, this macrocycle broken down into mesocycle and microcycle. So this mesocycle is going to be anywhere from a 3 week to a 6 month period. And this is going to consist of really three phases. Consist of your preparatory phase, competitive phase, and transition phase. So most of them are, pretty self-explanatory, especially if you relate it to the sports world. So preparatory phase is obviously going to be that first section of the year. What are you going to do in order to prepare for kind of that peak performance, right? So even if you aren't really competing per se, you still want to be able to figure out like what your peak is. So you have to treat training as waves, right? So you'll peak at a certain point, and then you have to lower your training volume and intensity for a little bit so your body can recover. And this is not just on a weekly basis, but over a long period of time too, right? So you'll amp up for a while on this mesocycle, and then you'll have to kind of ease off a little bit and then ramp back up. And this will spread over a month, a year, a week, and just keep going depending on how long you train for, which I'm obviously going to recommend that you continue training for the rest of your life in one way, shape, or form. But with that being said, going back into your mesocycle, preparatory phase, so that first 3 week to 6 month period, my recommendation is that you start with the basics, right? So depending on how experienced you are, if you're brand new to working out, weight training, running, whatever it is that you are training for, start with the basics. This is not where you're going to go all out and try to necessarily push yourself to the limit, but this is going to be where you build your base, right? So there's a common saying, you can't shoot a cannon from a canoe. That's because your base has to be solid. And that can be applied to so many different things. But in this case, you have to have a solid base before you continue to build yourself up, right? So let's take running, for example, right? So your running form might be absolutely trash. But even with your running form being trash, you might be able to still run 1 to 2 miles. But if your goal is to, let's say, run a marathon or a half marathon, if your running form is trash, you might not have been able to feel that early on in your training when you're running, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles. But the more you stack those miles on, you're going to start getting knee pain, ankle pain, restricted mobility, lack of energy because you're not having a very efficient form. All these things can pile up because you didn't have a solid base. You didn't have a solid running form to begin with. So you always want to make sure that you have a good base. Same thing can be applied to weight training. If your form isn't good, you are probably going to end up with some sort of injury, whether it's pulled muscle, some sort of mobility issue. But if you have a solid base and a solid foundation, that is something that is far less likely to happen. So in this preparatory phase, you're getting the basics down, your form or conditioning, and then once you get into the competitive phase, this is when you really start to amp things up, right? So this is when you're doing all-out efforts. This is your peak. This is all out, you challenging yourself. And then afterwards, you're going to hit your transition phase. And this is when you go from your competitive phase to basically your restorative phase, right? So it's going to be this constant cycle, right? So Macrocycle is going to be a year, and it's going to have these 3 cycles within it, right? And after your competitive phase, you have to recover, right? So your body can only maintain that high level output for so long before it has to take a long restorative period, right? So I'm not saying don't do anything, take a month off, go eat a hamburger and a pizza every day. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to actively recover and make sure that your body is ready to go for the next cycle. So once you get done with your transition phase, this is usually going to be between 3 and 6 weeks, depending on how your body was affected by the competitive phase. But after this 3 to 6 weeks of active recovery and, kind of going back into the basics a little bit, then you're going to go again back to the basics. Start building your foundation up again. Now your foundation this time is going to be different. It's going to be higher, right? So you've already trained yourself up for the basics. But in the weightlifting room, you need to make sure that your form hasn't gotten jacked up over time because you tried to add an excessive amount of weight and you were compromising volume, intensity, strength for your form quality. That's unacceptable. Like, you always have to go back and look at the basics. So the second time you come around, your basic phase might be a little bit different. It might be a little bit shorter than it was last time. But something you can start doing is you can add a little bit more weight, right? So I said you already had your foundation built. Use that to your advantage. Now you can add weight or power or speed, whatever the case may be, depending on what your art form is or your sport is. You can add to it, right? And over the years of you going through this cycle of preparatory, competitive, and transition, you are going to continue to build up. You'll see the waves continuing to build up over time. And it's really important. So a lot of people, you'll see all kinds of ads for people promising shortcuts to either losing weight or gaining strength, muscle mass, speed, being able to run for a long time. Whatever it is, it's not going to work. Not in the long term. It's not how we were meant to live. It's not how we were meant to survive. It doesn't work for the long term. You might get a quick fix. It's the same with money. You don't get rich instantly, right? I'm not a financial advisor by a long shot, but I can promise you that investing over time is a lot more effective and a lot more rewarding than someone who is going and buying a lottery ticket. Yeah, okay. Maybe if you do steroids, you get ahead of everyone, but at what cost? It's just not worth it. So to get back on track, Sorry about that. Something I'm passionate about. Don't do steroids. But you have to come up with a game plan, right? And of course, me as a personal trainer and my team, we're here for you. That is what our job is. You tell us your goal, we sit down with you, we come up with a plan, you tell us about anything that you might have, any kind of hesitations about, either mentally, physically. I'm a corrective exercise specialist, right? So if you have any like weakness of the knees, shoulder immobility, anything like that, I'm not a physical therapist, but we can do small tweaks. We can continue to build up those joints or add a little bit of flexibility and mobility, balance into your training to kind of help compensate for that, right? That's part of our jobs. And it's something I'm really passionate about because I think a lot of people jump into surgery too soon and then have to go through physical therapy. But if they had just gone through the process of yoga or strengthening up the opposite ligaments or X, Y, and Z, then you might have been able to prevent surgery and the physical therapy. Start with something that you can control, right? Now, it might not be the case for everyone. Some people might actually need to go do surgery, but that's not always a requirement. Sometimes you just got to put in a little bit of work on the forefront of things to prevent damage in the long term.